The regulatory landscape around climate policy is shifting, and many agencies are left with outdated tools to manage modern risks. The Federation of American Scientists Center for Regulatory Ingenuity hopes to give them a clearer path, offering practical guidance, partnerships, and support for innovative approaches. We'll talk through that mission with Dr. Hannah Safford, Associate Director of Climate and Environment at FAS. Dr. Safford, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here, Terry. Thank you.
I'm excited to talk about this new center at the Federation of American Scientists, the Center for Regulatory Ingenuity. Although I have to say, when I first hear the title, it sounds a little bit like an oxymoron. People don't usually put regulation and ingenuity together. So start off by telling us a little bit about FAS's vision for this center.
Yeah, so let me just start with really quickly a little bit about FAS, the Federation of American Scientists. So FAS is an 80-year-old organization that has a long history of connecting technical experts with policymakers to try and drive impact on the most pressing, complex societal challenges of our time. One of those challenges is climate change. And over the past year, we've been thinking about how do you build a durable, ambitious version of climate policy that's really well matched to the dynamic and rapidly evolving society that we have in the 21st century. And when we started to think about that question and look at the regulations that have always underpinned climate policy, it turns out that those regulations aren't dynamic and aren't 21st century. A lot of the bedrock environmental laws upon which most of U.S. climate policy has been built were passed back in the 1970s, and they were really designed for an era when the predominant environmental challenge of our time was industrial pollution, and that's it's a relatively straightforward policy design problem to tackle. You say, okay, we're going to set limits on the amount of pollution, and we're going to ratchet those limits down over time, and then we're going to crack down on anybody who goes outside of those limits. And it turns out that that's much more challenging to do when you're talking about climate change, where you have emissions coming from a whole bunch of different sources, when transitioning to clean energy sources isn't just a command and control problem, but it really involves very complex questions of economic policy, trade policy, industrial policy, and thinking about second and third order effects of that kind of transition. And so that's where we started thinking about this concept of regulatory ingenuity. How do you be very creative and clever, i.e. ingenious, in both how you design and apply regulations in climate context?
You described the challenge of regulating in the 21st century. What are some of the biggest mismatches you see in environmental challenges compared to the regulatory and legislative structure that we have?
You know, I started thinking about this actually in my previous position. I was working at the White House under the Biden administration. I was the director for transportation and resilience at the Climate Policy Office. And so in that context, I was working on the Biden era vehicle regulations. And one of the big package of vehicle regulations that we have is fuel economy standards. And fuel economy standards were designed, again, decades ago, kind of back in the 70s and 80s, and they were designed to push gas cars to be more efficient. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense when an increasing percentage of your vehicle fleet is electric. You start thinking about the standards that say, okay, this is the number of miles to the gallon that a car needs to get. But if your car gets infinite miles to the gallon because it doesn't actually use any gallons, you have a divide by zero problem, and the math actually gets very challenging. And agencies have had to start designing kind of creative ways to incorporate electric vehicles into a regulatory scheme that just wasn't designed for that. Similarly, the Clean Air Act was designed to help clean up industrial air pollution from smokestacks and tailpipe emissions, but it was developed in an era before we recognized climate change as the very serious, prevalent environmental challenge that it is today. So legally, it's not as durable because it just was written without climate change in mind. That doesn't mean that the spirit of the law couldn't be construed to be tackling climate challenges as well as sort of lower level air pollution challenges, but it's just not as designed from the ground up to be tackling climate.
I'm speaking with Dr. Hannah Safford. She's Associate Director of Climate and Environment at the Federation of American Scientists. You've been outspoken about the rollback of EPA's endangerment finding and the wider uncertainty that creates in the federal climate regulation space. How does that shifting landscape shape CRI's focus and the kind of support it wants to provide to policymakers?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that the endangerment finding was a tremendous lift back in 2009 by federal employees and the technical experts who worked with them. It's a technically rigorous finding, and all of the rules that have been built on top of that finding are technically rigorous as well. A sudden rollback of the endangerment finding is wrong on its legal and scientific merits. With that said, endangerment, the Clean Air Act is one tool in the climate policy toolbox. And it turns out that as clean technologies have become increasingly affordable, commercial, and high performing, we now have access to a lot of other tools as well as regulatory tools that can help drive forward deployment of those technologies in a rapid and equitable way. So take zero emission trucks as one example. Maybe I'll use the example of California, which has been a leader on driving deployment of zero emission trucks. The traditional approach has been to say, okay, here's going to be the number of trucks that are zero emission that manufacturers need to sell every year, and we're going to sort of track that over time. But then you start to run into challenges of, well, how do you afford those trucks, and what does the total cost of ownership look like? And if you're giving grants to support deployment of those trucks, manufacturers might tend to price right at the grant ceiling. So we have a lot of kind of creative tools that can lower the initial access, financial access to trucks, tools that can create more market transparency around pricing that therefore invites more competition and brings costs down even further, infrastructure that can make it even more attractive to be running and operating fleets of zero emission trucks, and all of these pair very nicely with a regulatory backbone.
That example kind of leads me into my next question. CRI is pitched as this place for big ideas, but also as a bridge between policy design and real-world implementation. So how does that architecture drive the kind of work that you do and the people that you engage and the products that you generate?
The way that we're building out CRI is according to a three-part structure. So part one is big cross-cutting ideas that we think need to underpin the next of climate policy. We're on a precipice of a new chapter in climate where, again, clean technologies are increasingly commercial. Clean technologies are increasingly woven into the fabric of our economic systems at all levels. And so what does it look like to have a climate policy that's designed for that next chapter? Then we're starting to map those big ideas to three key sectors: energy, housing, and transportation. These are sectors that people care about. They are kitchen table issues, and they also collectively account for 2/3 of U.S. emissions. And then finally, we're trying to translate those opportunities into really near-term playbooks, recognizing that we don't have to wait for 3 years until there maybe is a change in administration to drive forward more ambitious climate policy. There's actually quite a bit that motivated state and local leaders can do right now that's both directly responsive to the real-world challenges that everyday Americans are facing when it comes to affordable housing, stable, secure energy, safe, reliable transportation, while also driving down emissions in a very durable way.
And you've got partners across the spectrum: climate law, local government. How did those partners then help you test those big ideas and develop those playbooks? Do they bring their ideas to the table and get them all incorporated?
What FAS is trying to do with CRI isn't trying to do this alone, for sure. We are establishing CRI as a network hub for any organization that is interested in thinking really generatively and creatively about what the next era of climate policy looks like. And so to that end, like you said, we have some core partners in, for instance, the Environmental Law Institute, Climate Group North America, ICLEI USA, which is a network of hundreds of local governments that are committed to sustainability and climate action across the country. And we also have dozens of other institutions from the left and the right who are collaborating with us on more informally on subsets of the project. We're really excited to talk to others who are thinking about what a path forward, what a next era looks like, and are willing to be a little off the wall. So if that sounds like you, we would love for you to get in touch.
And what might the future look like for CRI? Will it stay focused on environmental policy? Do you imagine it branching out into other sectors or doing other kinds of work?
We established CRI with an initial focus on climate because it's one of the areas where we think that the mismatches between the policy tools that we have and the policy tools that we need is particularly evident. With that said, regulatory ingenuity as a concept, ingenuity and creativity and cleverness in regulatory design paired with creativity and cleverness in regulatory application is a general concept that could be applicable to a whole bunch of different policy domains. So we envision that insights that come out of CRI with respect to things like technology financing or public participation in rulemaking, these are directly applicable to other policy domains, and maybe moving forward, CRI has a particular focus on some other domains as well.
I've been speaking with Dr. Hannah Safford. She's Associate Director of Climate and Environment at the Federation of American Scientists. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.